this is IBM Museum. And this video took a little bit of prep, just me gathering some items. So I'm kind of glad because it has some segments that I'll be able to cover that'll be very applicable. And I won't do, or at least I'll have a follow-up video to this that I go through and work with the executive workstation itself. That 7496 of the previous video, I went through, connected up the postcode reader to it, and started up in no video. We kind of learn what that is, and I'll go through and explain a little bit better for portions of that video where I didn't cover or wasn't quite correct in some of the statements. And so behind me here, I've got the testing rig. And I'll go through and let me hide my internal webcam just so I know I have the full picture to work with here and kind of show what I have set up. So I do have a Model 30 planer, just like what is in the executive workstation, same BIOS version. I've gone through and transferred the RAM. I'll speak about that in a moment to this planer. And I've got a lot of time. This is kind of a short leash when you get to talking about some of these cables. And that's why I've had to go through and this convoluted arrangement of just a padded envelope that's folded over to support the 720 KB diskette drive that I have here. I've got actually a boot diskette in the drive, and of course put on the riser. I do have the power supply plugged in, which is kind of another short leash as it is, and had to go through. I intended to even have the executive workstation up here because I thought at the start of this, I wanted to go through and even turn it around and being able to go through and plug in that video cable of it and, you know, show it or to see if anything came up on the screen with the working system. Just all the disembodied components outside of that. And I tried to go through some of the structure for different segments of the video too, of the way to best present it on the screen. As you can see, I've got, you know, just my standard backdrop here, and I've got my clear click device, and I can go through and I have, of course, the widescreen off to the side. I can go through and it captures video, but I also have my camcorder input that runs through it. And I just go through, and people have seen me on video to go through and I switch between HDMI and VGA, depending if I want the camcorder on HDMI or the video capture on this VGA. It's a real quick way for me to capture the video output of the systems I have up on the bench. But it doesn't allow me to run the camcorder or present the camcorder screen at the same time that I'm capturing video off the system. And so I've gone through some steps and have some items off here to the side for that as well. Now, let me go through and I'll bring up the Model 30 planer that I intended to put in the executive workstation. I mean, I knew that I had a planer that, I mean, I've got pictures of this planer anyway. And so I knew that this was a very close match to what is in the executive workstation. It's a brown color exactly like this. And what kind of raises a little bit more of my suspicions, this one is not really, I've had other Model 30 planers that I've pinned in markings of when they were made, even prior to the release of the PS2 line in April of 1987. And the This one doesn't have it, but I suspect that this is an early planer as well. And the interesting aspect here is that it has actually a bodge wire from one of the MCGA video chips to back towards the connector. And I've seen this bodge wire on other planers, and of course, IBM went through when they produced a design and they figured out that a trace or something else didn't work, and so they went through and added these bodge wires. And it's just a real thin piece of wire. It's meant for a trace that just for some reason wasn't there, or they rerouted or something else, and they tack it down with just sticky glue spots and solder it in at either side. Now, these are the actual two MCGA video chips, and there's a gate controller for the excuse me. There is a video memory controller, and then there is the gate array chip. And I'll link in in the video description a page that Major Tom had gone through and worked on and published. And he had a copy before, just didn't get it published, and went through and updated it and included some really great information on there, and talks about provides an update for where these chips, it's actually this, and this is being on the P planar of the MUL30, just like the Type 1 MUL25 planar that was released later on, has this particular chip, this 72X8300. Okay, and that's a Seiko Epson logo, and of course you see the Japan marking to that as well. And that they produce all the chipset that's on the MUL30 and MUL25 planers. I really strongly suspect that they went through and were associated with the development of the MUL30, which it came out first, and then that just carried over to the MUL25. The main assumption with that too was that there was a later released Epson Equity 1E, and it's a virtual Model 30 clone. It has the same stats, the same, even for that dated time frame of how late it was released, and it was released primarily in the Japanese market as well, to where it had an 8086 CPU, and the chipset was redesigned. It doesn't have, of course, the IBM markings. I can include the link to where a page of information is on the Equity 1E. But it did also have MCGA video. And it's the only system outside IBM that had MCGA video. And it was released at a time frame that normally IBM would have seen that as competition and would have legally challenged them on how closely that matched the MUL30. But in this case, it just looks like that they were released to sell in more of the Japanese market, that wouldn't cross compete with IBM so much. And I'm presuming that because they did the design, they just said, hey, or it was under contract that a certain time span had to elapse and they could go through and release their own designs on that. Or they developed it with IBM early on to say, after a time frame, they could go through and they could derive a design from that as well. But This particular chip was replaced later on with the Type 2 planer on the Mall 25 and the so-called Greenwich planer that replaced this on the Mall 30. And that was the only chip that was replaced. There's actually what they call an engineering change announcement from IBM on replacing the Type 1 planers on Mall 25s with the Type 2 planer. And there wasn't a comparable announcement on the Mall 30 side for that. It may have been that there wasn't a need, that the Greenwich planer was out there enough on enough Mall 30s, or they thought it was that they're past the curve, that they were no longer really worried about the Mall 30s that may have a particular fault in the video chipset that they need to replace them. Now, this actually has the this is the VRAM for the MCGA, these spots here. And I was even prepared to go and use this planer to, this is right what I can go through and put in the executive workstation. I want to get that planer out because I'm going to go through and examine a lot more to having that planer out and visible, not under that, where it doesn't have that drive platform and everything else masking out a certain area, just so it can be worked with in the open. And although it does have these video chips out and exposed on the executive workstation, it's a little bit hard with the screen on top of things and everything else. I want to have a case or a test bench like this because you can hit these chips with a cold spray and that can cause them to start working or can go through and resolve issues. Now, I got working with this, and then all of a sudden I realized that there's one component of that RAM DAC chip. And this is the only instance I've seen a RAM DAC that's actually socketed on an IBM planer. And I don't know why it's missing. I didn't go through and pull it, but I've got to go through the RAM DACs are available. I need to go through and I'll actually order one because I do plan to put this planer in the executive workstation just for it matching a lot of the originality. And so maybe even this bodge wire might fix the issue that's at play with that. Because you have things like monitor IDs with MCGA and in more particular into the VJ standard to where the system senses what type of monitor is connected, what resolution that monitor is connected to or capable of. Now, there's another aspect here in my test rig, and it got to the point where, this is the connection for that MCGA video out. And you notice, of course, one of those pin openings is blocked. And V Westlife actually had a rather recent video, talked about, hey, using a more modern display with an IBM system, because that's just that makes sure that it's only a certain cable that's put in there. And if you have a cable that is fully pinned like this, all 15 pins, we'll make sure that it gets I'm able to focus and everything else. That doesn't physically connect. Now, V Westlife in his video, he went through and he just had a hot paper clip or hot needle or something else and poked out a hole in there, which is not all that hard to do as well. And I just didn't want to say paperclip around the executive workstation for what I have set up. And I tried to comment, and YouTube goes through and blocks links unless it's your own video content, in the comments you leave and everything else. But I want to bring up about these, just these little, and I got a pack of these, and this is like $7 off of Amazon. And I'll include a link for these in the video description as well. Might as well, I'm including everything else. And it is, has all the pins, openings for pins on this side. And then on the other side, and I modified the one I have out, but let me go through and pull another one out just to kind of show. And, this is fully populated on that other side. And so ahead of this video, I went through, even had the pin, and just, doesn't even have to be that good of needle nose. Just even something as blunt nosed as that, just going through, and that's the one I modified, going through and making sure, of course, that you get the right pin, but going through, and you can see where it just pulled that pin out from there. You latch onto it with the needle nose and just pull, and it comes out of there. And then you have just an interposer that goes on that connection and allows you to go through and put a fully populated cable in there. And of course, tighten down because it's got all the screws that have to go through and be coupled in for the connector to properly seat. But I did that because I've got one of these cables on my little station back here that goes in here and feeds the screen. I've got a screen down below and I've got a screen up top here. It's got dual video output, and I'm just doing that as a background, of course, so I can do titling and things like that. I can get a little bit more elaborate. And this station is actually going to go elsewhere. It's going to move out of the way that allows me a little bit more room in this area. It's just I'm affected by the leash that actually goes up, and this is a VGA connector. And I went through and I determined it had all 15 pins. And so I said, oh, okay, where's the bag for those interposers so I can modify one? And I didn't think that the VGA connection is actually for the modder that I have elsewhere out of view. And it's actually the display port input goes to this modder here. And so I could simply go to the VGA cord that I have here and just switch inputs on this back monitor. And I'll do that later in the video for powering the system up. And this already has the pin out of there. It came that way. It's not been modified by me. So I went through and modified this interposer for nothing, but heck, it's for good, or this one it's for good content, I guess. And so to the video aspect, as I said, I wanted to go through and have a lengthy video, as this one's going to probably turn out anyway, just with this material, that I would have the executive workstation, even with that screen kind of off the side to it, and I would go through and connect up that output just to see if I'd get something on the screen and make sure that all that works as well before I'd put in the planer and everything else, because there may be a possibility of having to recap within that display. It's a possibility. And even to the thought, I wasn't worried about that power supply in the executive workstation powers the Model 30 planer that's inside, or the planer of the system, and also powers the display. That planer would be effectively live inside the executive workstation too, or it would have to be connected for me to get things to work. And I wouldn't necessarily be worried, and that although that planer would have the potential to power up and go through, and it's going to, of course, going to stop at the postcodes. It's not connected to anything, so it's no worry. It's no worry that there's no um, display output from it or anything else, because the Model 30 planer does have the for the RAM of it. It's got the two SIMs that are 256 kilobyte each. And then it has actually memory that's soldered onto the planer as well. And this is actually 128 KB of system memory that is mapped at the lowest address. And so you can even, without any SIMs populated on the planer, this board could even function to some extent with just that basic 128 KB. And you look at the initial IBM PC came out with 64 KB, or as little as 64 KB could be a possibility in those environments. And of course, it wouldn't run much in later DOS versions or anything else. But just for what it's worth, if that planer, I could go through and even pull the SIMs out of there. Now, we'll talk CPUs here in a moment as well, that this board could effectively run. And I'm not able to get at the CPU and the floating point unit socket. And undoubtedly, it doesn't have this populated. So on the P planer, this is a socket for the 8086, or you can go through and you can actually upgrade these by putting a NEC V30 chip in there, and runs at 8 megahertz, just the same. It's just a little bit more efficient of chip, that you get a little bit more oomph out of the system. And this is a socket for the floating point unit math coprocessor, like or actually not like, it would have to be the Intel 8087 or pin equivalent that would go in that. Most commonly just the straight Intel 8087 is what you're going to find. And even on this planer that I have benched right now, it's got an 8087 populated on it, and that can go through and, as I've reported in earlier videos, gets more current draw and can have that issue of the MCGA video not working well in the cases where you have a bunch of power draw with the equipment that's connected in. This benched planer has an 8086. On other systems I have around Model 30, I've got V30s. I actually even have more spare V30s chips that could be put in this instead. I just probably will use the 8086 that I have in this bench planer. And then going through, speaking of short leashes, I wanted to go through as well with putting the display output to where it can be seen. Also, I wanted to do a short lead, and that's just the parallel port, and it's a little cable. It's probably 8 or 9 inches of cable length, and not really very flexible. I went through and ended up using painter's tape to fasten a cable to the display that I could go through, and for the parallel port postcode reader to be more visible, the digits, rather than it being plugged in the back and not really being visible on video. And I think I've got a real good setup now for this bench setup. In fact, let me go through. I'll set this planer out of the side, so it's just just what I have on the bench is what I'm prepared to power up. And I'll go through, and I don't even necessarily, I'll go through and pause just because I have the arrangement where I'm going to put the video output up on this screen, and that's not important. It's just people seeing that it boots up. I'm not going to go through and necessarily capture that video, but I'll still have to the point where I can go through and it's visible on the screen. And then also with the camcorder, I could even, other than the screen too, zoom in on that postcode reader just to show the digits a little bit better too. I do have other webcams and things like that I could set up, but it looked like it always interfered in the view. And so probably what I'll do here, I've got the camcorder, don't really even have to change the aspect. I don't have to change this. I'm not going to change the zoom because I want this screen to be visible back here. I don't even have to go through and turn off the system that I have feeding the video here. Just have to shift my to VGA. And of course, there's no video input. It says no video cable right now. But I'm going to go through, that's just a no video signal. Before it goes into a power state, I'm going to go through, we're going to power up the unit. Okay, and we see those postcodes changing. I don't think I need to go through and modify, the lighting, the ring light or anything like that. Okay, and we did see the RAM count, and it goes through and it's a 161 error, set date and time. And remember that battery on the riser only is for the real-time clock that's on the Mol 30 planer. Here's the real-time clock chip. That MM58167AN is the clock chip. And so it doesn't talk about that 163 error is the set configuration. Mol 25, Mol 30 on boot up, they go through and they auto configure. They'll switch it to set, it goes through and controls it from that register. Now, we've got on the screen, I've realized moving around the camcorder, I've gone to where the clock symbol's there. It's got the question marks blinking in the center, the 12, 3, 6, and 9 around the faces of that simulated clock. And it says resume equal F1 key in quotations. And as we saw the post codes, the last postcode, and I'll go through and explain that a little bit more deeper. On the 4-digit display, the code that's to the left, those 2 digits, that is the completed postcode. In other words, on this, it's gone through, it says 13FF right now. And in fact, let's go through again. I'll power it off, power it back on. So those the digits on the left, the 2 digits are the postcode that's completed. Focus went out just right at the time where I wanted to have it. And the 2 digits on the right are the currently executing routine that's the postcode number for the currently executing routine. So on the executive workstation, it shows 0607 is where it was halting at. Means it's completed the 06 check. That's all through with. That's the previous postcode. The 07 is what's halting on. And that's a very long routine that Major Tom went through, and he actually looked at the particular BIOS image that the executive workstation has, even though other BIOS versions are going to have similar code. They're going to go through and they can add or change some of that, but a lot of time those postcodes are going to remain the same, particularly low numbered postcodes are IBM wanted to keep them the same. So if you have mul 30, you know, that 06 or 07 always meant the same thing between the BIOS versions. And that is the MCGA initialization routine in BIOS. This is 07. And so that's showing that something is going wrong with the MCGA video initialization. That makes a ton of sense. It probably is the case where there's some repair in there. What I'm thinking for the executive workstation is IBM went through they had mul 30 planers that were produced and had 720 KB drives. They had risers for the mul 30, and they went through and by the markings on the addresses on the box, by a box being shipped to IBM from a company, a different company, and then IBM going through and later on they had that system there in Kentucky, or I forget. I don't have the box as close by to look at that address again. You just have to look on that video. That's when it was sent to Computer Reset. All those systems, the executive workstation systems that Computer Reset received, got Richard's name on them, that were mailed from, and they were mailed at a point, shipped to him probably at a point where they said, oh, it's past due for these systems. I think it was Richard bought Computer Reset initially in 1997, if I've read correctly. And so that was way past the prime of the PS2s, and probably IBM was just selling off old stock that they had just to get rid of it. And so Richard was able to acquire them and have them at Computer Reset. And then that's where that one unit has come to me. And so I think that that other company went through and they were to design the executive workstation with those components. And we've looked closer at the badge. I'll get through when I have the unit fully set up to go through and look at the badge a little bit more, but it talks about a custom terminal on the badge. It has a very small footprint, and that does make sense that it could have been where IBM intended to have an emulation board like 3270 or 5250 emulation in there so they could be configured to emulate terminals of the mainframe and mini computers like the System 34, System 36, System 38, and even AS400 terminals for the 5250 emulation, or the 3270 for the mainframe emulation. And that could just be tucked back in a corner. The executive workstation has a pretty small footprint, and just for that executive to turn on and be able to access those big iron machines that they had on site, or could be set up with a token ring board that does that ripple, boots over the network, or an Ethernet adapter that boots over the network, doesn't have to have that diskette drive or anything else go into it. You just power it on and it goes through and boots for access to something on the company's network at that time that wasn't very common to have other networks set up, or just to access that server. They even had mainframe and mini computers that had that token ring interface as well. So there's still possibilities of where a use case for those machines. Now with this test bench, I've gone through, I've made sure that I've got all, good parts and pieces. You can see the marking on here. I've got good 10 August 2020 and I marked it 720 KB. This is the same diskette drive type that is in the executive workstation, that if that doesn't work, I can swap in a drive as well. So my next video is going to be going through, or once I get the RAM DAC, because I think I want to swap in this planar just for matching the brown colorization and everything else, looking more like the original is in there. I'd have to get a RAM DAC, and I'd have to wait on ordering process and everything else for that, rather than putting one of these grain ones in, or I can get one in and, you know, to change out later on as well is a very good possibility. Just to wrap a little bit of the series up on these, and then just do that brown planar at a later date, maybe the plan that I want to do. But from the keyboard that I have, plugged into here, the Model M, for that F1 resume, I've got the 720 KB boot diskette that I would use for the, if I had the executive workstation set up as well, or if it operated. Okay, it prompts me for the time and date. That's not really necessarily the most critical thing that I go through and do. But in that format of going through, and just to show it, this is able to take the 4-digit year, and that was the interesting thing of all the initial PS2s, the Model 30 having the real-time clock, a different real-time clock than the other PS2s of those initial PS2s, was not, that was year 2K corrected. This will actually go over the dates from 1999 to 2000 perfectly fine, just because of a different clock chip. And then, of course, the Model 25, as I said earlier, does not have the real-time clock chip. So set the date there. I realize it's getting late here, very late. And of course, I've got to go through and upload the video and everything else, but we've got a boot to MS-DOS. So if we had these components within the executive workstation, we would be able to get it to boot. The screen is another issue. I'll address that later on. I just wanted to have the components that would be in that executive workstation booting correctly. I know that everything works by the bench setup that I have, an ability to test components before I would affix them in the unit and put it all back together. So we could effectively have a system that goes through and does things. Now, probably as a final step, what I'll do is I'll switch back the input to that. Okay. And I will put in the video capture. Okay. And go through and I'll switch over to that. So we have it up on where we can see it here. Let me go through, since we don't have that phase difference for me having the built-in webcam. And I can go through, I can see my display in front of me and everything. You're looking over my shoulder. So I've got the Microsoft Diagnostics, MSD.exe, on that diskette as well. This is going to be the close of our video. I meant to go through and look how, that's not too bad. It'll be a 40-minute video. Okay, it's going through and loading the Microsoft diagnostic, checking over the system. Okay, and as we see that press the highlighted letter for going through, and it identifies it IBM 8088 or 8086/8087, and it's not surprisingly it's not able to tell between the 8088 and 8086. It is able to tell the difference between a V30 because I have gone through and tested that. But if we are able to do, going through and pressing that highlighted letter, we get the information there. It does show that it's an IBM BIOS, and it's interesting enough. It shows the BIOS version. That's actually the basic ROM basic string that's in there, as far as that version C1.10 is the ROM basic that's on the system, and identifies it correctly as a BIOS category of IBM PS2 model 30. And it's funny, it identifies it as a 286. This is just the 8086 version. It shouldn't have that 286 after it. That's just a failure of the Microsoft diagnostic. And even there, the BIOS ID bytes, the FA means an 8086 based CPU for an IBM system. That's the convention that IBM had. Whether other manufacturers did that, followed that. But the FA, the Microsoft diagnostic could be more specific to determining the CPU on there by that mechanism. And then the 00 is the submodel, and then 02 is the BIOS revision. Just like the Executive Workstation, this is revision 02. And it shows the BIOS date, and for being February the 5th of 1987, and the PS2's initial release at the Model 30 was the only 8-bit bus system in the initial PS2 release, and that was in April of 1987. The processor, it says 8088 or 8086. As I say, that FA convention from IBM could be done more specific to recognize that that is an 8086. The encoding for the 8088 was a CPU was a different character sequence. It was I think they even had FE and FF. Then the PC convertible, which was a different, a smaller form factor 8088 CPU, had even a unique identifier for that. The math coprocessor, I did say I have an 8087 on the planar. The keyboard is enhanced. It's that 101 key keyboard, bus type X, the XT classic bus. And of course, it's got the DMA controller, cascaded IRQ2 is yes, and that BIOS data segment, the EBDA, extended BIOS data area, being at address 9FC0 hex and is 1 KB in size. So we do OK for memory with an M. It does show and has scroll functionality. We don't have a mouse driver loaded, but if we do the arrow down, we go through and can easily see that. As I say, I could go through and I could even pull those sims and have 128 KB. That would be rather interesting, although I don't think that MS-DOS of these later varieties would work. So I'm pressing OK for that. Video, and it does identify the video by the MCGA. and pressing V for video. Manufacturer unknown. It's funny because IBM and again Seco Epson on that Epson Equity 1E are the only systems that have MCGA, and they always have it on the system planar. There's no MCGA adapters that you plug in, can plug in that to a bus that displays that. Model, I'm not sure what they mean or if that goes through with other systems or other identified other video standards are identified with that model. Display type is VGA color. That's in those monitor ID bits again. It's video mode 3, which is 80 columns and 25 rows. There's areas with the video BIOS version unpopulated. That would come in on VGA side, in particular VGA adapters that would populate, and for the version and date. VESA support installed? No, of course, that's a much later thing. Secondary adapter is none. And that is dealing with later systems than the Model 30. And of course, at the time frame that the MS-DOS 6.22 came out for the version here. So there's no network detected. And then OS version, pressing O, has that MS-DOS 6.22. And the various information with that. There's no mouse driver that's loaded. Other adapters, we don't have any, and that just looks like it detects the game adapter, which is a very simple routine of what I/O ports that's on. I do have game adapters I could plug in and see, how they're recognized. Disk drives, we just have A, and we have that 720 KB A drive. And just that last drive is a setting of the MS-DOS 6.22. That's all configurable, and that's just a default value that it has without a auto exec bat or config sys being loaded. Okay. LPT ports, and that's interesting. It shows 3 for all that. And yeah, there's the ability to have 3 in there, and it detects the extended BIOS data area. We saw that identified elsewhere in the system information, but we can only see the value that's populated for the LPT1. And I thought on the Model 30 that is a little bit strange, because I actually thought that was the 03 BC hex address on the Model 30. I didn't think it was that 0378 hex. And that might be interesting to check later on of how accurate the Microsoft diagnostic is for that, because that is different than what I expect. It wasn't adaptable on the Model 30, and they had it at that 03 BC address just to be out of the way effectively from the IO addresses that other ports could be. We see for LPT2 and LPT3, we've just got zeros in there for the port address, meaning that there is not any, those ports for LPT2 and LPT3 are not set up. So pressing OK for that. COM ports, and we have 1 COM port on the planar. And indeed, the UART, it's an 8250 UART, and set up just at the basic rate. There's not any other COM ports on there. Windows is not detected, of course, not on a single diskette. And then we have the IRQ status, pressing Q. And gets it working. I hope it doesn't seize or something else. I don't see it moving the drive or anything else like that. That may go through for what setup is here. That probably has. Yeah, that's probably seized up the system, is what it looks like. Although anything further, the TSR programs and device drivers, we don't have any of that effectively on the system booting from that 720 KB diskette. Doesn't have any of those populated. So yeah, it looks like for the IRQ status is a big no-no for going through. And I think I've seen that before with the MAL30. So I just did the Control-Delete to do a warm boot. And we'll even have, I've got a voltmeter Pi. I need to go through. I would have probably for the date of these batteries on the risers, they're probably expended. And I probably need to go through and among the other risers I have and check the voltage and even put in new batteries in them. It's interesting for that it did, well, once I continued, we'll see without the autoexec.bat, it just went back to a default date. But, this would be, as I say, this is the bench components that the executive workstation would have. It's going to go through and it's going to report itself as a MAL30 since it has the BIOS and the planar from that MAL30. But this is what we'd see on that little tiny screen. And we still have to do that angle or I put everything back together and probably just do that one of those, this green planar that's on there. And I'll pull the Mathco processor off first. There's no reason to go through and load that little tiny power supply down. And I need to get more details. I needed to figure out the wattage of that unit. It can't be much at all for that power supply. And I'll put things together and see if we can get anything from the screen. There may even be a possibility of doing a mock-up just of having the bench stuff I have here and having the body of the executive workstation off to the side and having that screen where I can go through and plug it into this planar and get some video output on the screen. So that's, a good, it's going to be an hour video, close enough to it. I went through on this occasion too. I'm using my Anchor headset. I know on the previous video, it's able to, you listen to the audio there and it's enough to make out what I'm saying and everything else. It never loses enough quality as I've had in the past, where that audio's broken up. But I just wanted to avoid the issue here. And if I use these for the live stream, they're perfectly capable of going through and I'm able to do a video recording. And I'll go through and when I proof the video, I'll check the audio levels, but I think it'll be a lot better for this. And the reason I wear these for the live stream is I can just raise the boom. It's just like a cost switch where it mutes the mic. And once I drop the boom again, now I have to keep track of that. And it tells me, mic is muted or mic is unmuted as I go through and do that. But it's probably going to be better quality sound out of that as well. So that's probably another improvement I've done on regards to the video for this particular one. But that's good. I didn't even have to go through and pause the video to switch connections or anything else. I had a pretty good arrangement of this in the able to see the boot screen as well as that postcode reader, and that postcode being very instrumental for these systems. Anyone that works on these PS2s, get you one of these postcode readers, and I can provide a link for that as well. I'll have to remember when I upload the video and add all the video description of all the links that I promised to add in this video, and I think I've got them straight and can do that. But I'll go through and also add a link to where you can pick up one unaffiliated seller on eBay, and you can get them within the United States. You can get them for less than $10 USD, and probably even closer to $8 or $9 with all the shipping and everything else. And they're instrumental to diagnose what's going on these PS2s or the systems that are derived from these PS2 models, like the Executive Workstation. So I hope that this video has been informative. If you've enjoyed it, click on that like button, please. Subscribe to my channel. It's all about the decimals now. I've got that 1 point whatever for being K for being over 1,000 subscribers, and that's going to show up my subscriber increases to the right of that decimal point for a time until I get above 2,000, of course. But hey, I went through and beyond 1,000 subscribers and want to go up even higher than that. So if you've got friends that are interested in this sort of content, be sure to recommend the channel to them as well. But this is IBM Museum. That's all I have for now. Thank you.